Good morning. You are a chatty group. Good morning. So, every time I do a wedding, one of the things that I ask the people who are getting married to do is to turn around and try to make eye contact with everybody who's attending the wedding. And I'm going to ask you to do that now. See if you can just look everybody who's here in the face. And you can talk about those who aren't here. As long as you repeat that to me. We are sparse today. Why is that? Maybe people are sick and tired of this theme. No? Yeah. The rapture occurred. Look who's loud. I saw a bumper sticker on a car that said, "In case of the rapture, can I have your car?" So, regarding the current theme, about which I'll say more about in the talk, I hope you stay for lunch today. We have plenty of food and free. Well, there's no free lunch, but you know what I mean. You don't have to pay for it. And talk around the table to the people. Each table will have a leader. Talk around the table about what you think about this current theme, what you would add to it, how you would modify it, or anything like that. Get to know each other better. And I want you to know how profoundly grateful I am for each one of you. I love what I get to do here. I'm very lucky that I get to do what I do here. And if it weren't for you, it would be awfully lonely in here. So I'm glad that you show up. Thank you. So, no matter who you are, no matter where you are on your spiritual journey, you are welcome here. And as I said, stay for lunch. Peace, love, joy. Peace, love, joy, and patience. Patience is my word for non-reactivity. So the goal of my teaching is peace, love, joy, and patience. All of my teaching to help us be mindful of the life and cultural changing power of peace, love, joy, and patience when we experience and then express them. I want to call us back to these things if we've strayed from our commitment to them, and to offer information and skill and knowledge and practices that we can use to strengthen, to grow in these things. Growth being the key thing. So peace, love, joy, and patience. And I want to begin today with a piece that is pure joy. And you don't have to write it down, although you will want to. It will be in the summary that goes out. If you don't get that, fill out an email card. But this is a piece that found me actually the Monday morning after Holly gave that outstanding talk. In my own daily practice, I was found by this paragraph. In Sunday school, I learned to think of God as a very old, white-bearded man on a throne who stood above creation and occasionally stirred it with a stick. When I'm dreaming quantum dreams, what I see is an infinite web of relationship flung across the vastness of space, like a luminous net. It is made of energy, not thread. As I look, I can see light moving through it as a pulse moves through veins. What I see what I see out there is no different from what I feel inside. There is a living hum that might be coming from my neurons, but might just as well be coming from the furnace of the stars. When I look up at them, there is a small commotion in my bones, as the ashes of dead stars that house my marrow rise up like metal filings toward the magnet of their living kin. Isn't that beautiful? So we're going to spend a few weeks talking about God. Not that such an understanding is possible. Our minds can't comprehend God. There was a story when I was in seminary. There were lots of stories about God when I was in seminary. But one of them was about a king who once called all his wise men together and said to them, I want you to go out into the kingdom and search high and low and find out for me if there are angels. Are angels real? I have heard of visitors from the heavenly realm called angels, but I have never seen one. Go find out if there are angels. So the wise men dispersed to the four corners of the kingdom, looking in all the libraries, searching all the wisdom literature, talking to both sages and common people with the question, are angels real? And after a year or so of intensive investigation, they returned to their king with their results. They summarized what they had discovered, and one of their number was designed to be the spokesman. Well, demanded the king, did you find if angels are real? Did you see any angels? And the spokesman said, no, we did not. But we heard plenty of rumors. So we shall begin to talk about rumors of and about God. And I'm doing this to help us clarify our thinking. I've said that one of the most life-transforming, world-transforming matters that we can get right is the understanding of our own identity. And I've said before that we are who we are in God, no more, no less. So who is God? Answering that question is critical to understanding our own identity. Does everyone have the same identity? What we believe about God shapes what we believe about ourselves, which shapes what we believe about other people, which in turn shapes our social and justice systems. And it will affect how we treat the planet. The matter of God is massively important. Now, the quote I read to you is from the writings of a woman named Barbara Brown Taylor. And I think it is a good place to start. It illustrates the humongous shift in which we live, where one order is clearly passing away and a new order is not yet in place. By the way, just this week, someone, knowing about my interest in Jungian psychology, brought me a flyer about a workshop that is coming up, sponsored by the Jungian Society of New York. And they're having Dr. James Hollis speak. And the theme for the conference is, in between times, something gone, something not yet. This person's comment was, not mine, great minds think alike. So I want you to hear Barbara Brown Taylor's words again. They are really just pure joy. And they reflect this shift that we are in. By the way, if you don't know who Barbara Brown Taylor is, she is an amazing speaker, writer, intellect, former Episcopal priest. Now she is not that. She is a speaker at large. Spiritual teacher is my term for her. And I'll put a link in the summary for those of you who are interested in finding out more about her. If you go on and do a Google search, I just think Google is just such a wonderful thing. You get all this information at your fingertips for free. You'll find page after page of quotes of Barbara Brown Taylor. And here are two that I found that really fit where we are culturally. To get God on your side is a great way to feel powerful. And another, she said, I can't help but note that God is being useful to a lot of people trying to harm each other. Now, what I like about this passage is not only does it fit this current theme, but it is also one that I said is just pure joy, peace, love, and joy. So I want you to listen to it again with some graphics. In Sunday school, I learned to think of God as a very old, white-bearded man on a throne who stood above creation and occasionally stirred it with a stick. When I am dreaming quantum dreams, what I see is an infinite web of relationship flung across the vastness of space like a luminous net. It is made of energy, not threads. As I look, I can see light moving through it as a pulse moves through veins. What I see out there is no different from what I feel inside. There is a living hum that might be coming from my own neurons, but might just as well be coming from the furnace of the stars. When I look up at them, there is a small commotion in my bones as the ashes of dead stars that house my marrow rise up like metal filings toward the magnet of their living kin. As I said, I found this right after Holly had stood here and said, we are made up of stardust. And the elements that are here are the elements that have been here for billions of years. I think this also represents a transition from a naive worldview to one that fully embraces the information of current joy, the full expansion of joy that we have an opportunity to experience. Now, my hunch is that every person in this room grew up being taught, either explicitly or by osmosis, that God was a larger-than-life, human-like person who lived up in the sky. Now, we might not have had Barbara Brown's way of seeing it, that God took a stick and stirred creation from time to time. But God was like a religious version of Santa Claus. He, always this imagining of God as male, had a list and was checking it twice. He's going to find out who's naughty or nice, so watch out, God's going to get you. I remember as a child watching my brother, who was 6 years older than me and mean to me. I watched him go through his crisis of faith, which in Tennessee meant starting to smoke, and challenged my parents about going to church. And he asked at the dinner table one day that he said, I don't believe in God anymore. And this greatly upset my parents. And my brother, at probably 12 or 13, said, all right, do you think God is all-powerful and can make an object that's unstoppable? And my parents said, well, of course. And then he said, well, do you think God is all-powerful and could make an object that is not movable? And they said, of course, but with a little less certainty. And then my brother said, and what if God got those two things together? And they had no answer. I know that's silly, but children have pre-critical, naive religious beliefs that eventually break down, and what do they put in their place? So what I want to share with you today is some of my own evolving understanding of God. This is my personal God journey, if you will. It will be like sharing pictures with you out of my photo album of my spiritual journey. And it may remind you of some places that you've been, or it may tempt you to go some places that you've heard about but not been. I hope it will be useful. long before I heard of people like Pierre de Chardin, Ilia Delio, Thomas Berry, Richard Rohr, Michael Dowd, Daramud Oruchu, and many others. I was beginning to have my own evolving understanding of God. Very early in my studies, I was more interested in psychology than in religion or theology. I did know some stirrings were taking place in the arena of theology. The word theology comes from two words, theos, having to do with God, and logos, meaning understanding of. So theology is understandings of God, reasonings about God. And in seminary, we had all kinds of theology. We had systematic theology and historical theology and biblical theology. Systematic theology is where we could break God down into God's disparate parts and tell you what they were. We could describe God for you. The first memory shift I can remember in my own understanding came when I had just begun my religious studies. And I heard about a little book by a man named J.B. Phillips. Phillips was a Bible scholar from England, and he had written a translation of the New Testament that was very popular at the time because it was readable and it was understandable. It was in really kind of common language. And he wrote a book called Your God is Too Small, a guide for believers and skeptics alike. His claim in this book, which was published in 1950, was that we had not found a God big enough for our modern needs and thus suffered from a limited idea of God. Now, it's been over 50 years since I've read this book, but there are parts of it, I went back and looked, that still speak to me because Phillips exposed some of the very limited and useless ideas people had about God and that people still have about God. There are ways that everybody in this room has had at one time or another of thinking about God. God is a resident policeman. God is the grand old man. You know, the man upstairs. God is meek and mild. This is the Jesus understanding of God. God is the managing director. God is my co-pilot. There was a book that came out during the war. I think this book started significant conversations among people about what do you think about God? How do you understand God? I had also read around that time two collections of sermons by Paul Tillich that really helped solidify my decision to pursue psychology. The first I read was a book that someone had given to my father as a gift. I don't think they knew what they were doing when they did it. But it was a book of sermons by Paul Tillich called The Courage to Be. And in this book, there is the most powerful passage on acceptance and self-acceptance I have ever encountered. And in case you don't know it, I want to read it to you. Simply, you are accepted. You are accepted. Accepted by that which is greater than you, and the name of which you do not know. Do not ask for the name now. Perhaps you will find it later. Do not try to do anything now. Perhaps later you will do much. Do not seek for anything. Do not perform anything. Do not intend anything. Simply accept the fact that you are accepted. If that happens to us, we experience grace. After such an experience, we may not be better than before, we may not believe more than before, but everything is transformed. In that moment, grace conquers sin and reconciliation bridges the gulf of estrangement. And nothing is demanded of this experience, no religious or moral or intellectual presupposition, nothing but acceptance. That's a powerful paragraph. And it is true that courage is needed for this acceptance. I can tell you in years of doing clinical work with clients that it's the hardest thing for people to do, to accept the fact that they're accepted. People sometimes say, if you really knew me, you wouldn't like me. And the truth is, if we really knew you, we would love you more. How could you not love what is made in the image of God? This is a profoundly helpful book to me and hopeful in the area of psychology. I could spend a whole class talking about this paragraph. The other book of Tillich's that affected me at this time was a book called The Shaking of the Foundation, and you can see that it's worn. What you may not be able to see that it cost all of $1.25. This shaking of the foundations, that comes from a phrase in Isaiah. I had begun to understand by reading Paul Tillich. He had 3 volumes of systematic theology that started being published when I was in the university. 2 was published in this period of time. 1 was not published till I went to the seminary. We were all waiting to see what would be in that. But here is where I began to understand that in Tillich's way of thinking, God was best described as the ground of being. Now, this is a massive thinker. Tillich was a massive thinker. And he said, God is not a being. God is being itself. Now, I want you to let the implications of that sink in for a minute. God is the ground of being. What Tillich is saying is that God is not a noun. God is a verb. Now, Tillich's just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to talking about what was going on in the academic world in the field of philosophy and theology, thinking about God. There is a phrase that some of you have heard, God is dead. You can find this phrase in the writings of Nietzsche and others dating back to before the 1900s, the late 1800s. I would say that the influence of people like Paul Tillich and others didn't go very far from the academic circles. It didn't make it into local churches. This thinking did not make it into local churches. Now, there is a curious circle of influence about what determines what we think is real. And that circle of influence starts with culture. Culture influences what is real until there is a crisis in science that culture cannot deny, which then causes culture to rethink its definition of reality and embrace that until there is another crisis in science. Now, does this make sense what I'm saying? I'm going to give you 2 illustrations to make it make sense better. Copernicus, the one that we have been talking about, made the scientific discovery that the Earth was not the center of the cosmos, but the sun was. And the culture, run largely by the church, opposed that. They said, you can't say that, because if you do, it's going to upset the major tenets and doctrines of the church, so we will not allow that truth to be true. Until the evidence continued to mount up by others who were doing math and algebra and geometry and figuring all these laws out, and finally the church relented, and culture redefined its understanding of what was real. So there is this dance that goes on. Culture, science, crisis, redefinition of reality. I'll give you one more. And I could dip into this field in a couple of significant places, but one is the field of medicine. There was a time when the evidence that you were a good doctor was your bloody smock, because it indicated that you were not afraid to be with your patients in the life and death circumstances, and that you weren't afraid to get your hands dirty. There was also a very high rate of mortality in the surgeries that these doctors performed, particularly in medically assisted birth. There was a very high infant and mother mortality rate until Lister and others said, you know, there are these tiny bacteria that are actually causing the death, and if you would clean your instruments and wash your hands, the mortality rate would go down. And you know what? It was resistant because it wasn't real. Until the crisis continued to mount and the evidence grew until it could not be denied anymore, and then it began to be true. So there's culture, there's science, and then there is a different understanding of reality. I think this is fascinating. It's fascinating for me to know that reality doesn't change. It's our understanding of reality that shifts. The culture in which theology or religious thinking was done was not shaped by Paul Tillich. It was shaped by the American culture. This is where the context of religion was being done in the 50s. The religious reality was shaped much more by the culture than it was by the academic community. And an illustration of that is what happened in this culture in the 50s. We rewrote the Pledge of Allegiance to say that the United States was now one nation under God. It would have been more accurate to say one nation under Canada. We're one nation under God, and we did that to fight off that scourge of godless communism from Russia. That was the reality of that time. Also was that if we were under a nuclear attack, you just hide under your desk and everything will be over. We're in a time when the consensual understanding of reality is shifting, and it's scaring the daylights out of some people. I came to Houston in 1966 to begin my work and training here, and I had not been here but a few months. When Time magazine had on its cover what has remained the most renowned cover in the history of publishing, it boldly asked the question, is God dead? Now, I spent hours online trying to find the obituary that was written about God after this magazine came out, and I could not find it. If one of you is lucky enough to put your hands on it, I will read it here next Sunday. It has a lot of great lines in it, like Billy Graham claims, I knew God well, I'm going to miss him. And the Pope saying, as far as I could tell, he was a nice guy. Things like that. It was funny, but I couldn't find it. It's amazing that you can't find things like that. So the 60s came on us, and they were daring times in lots of ways. The country was divided then, just as well as now. There were long hairs and hippies on one hand and hard hats on the other. That's how they were characterized. It was a time when all sorts of things were called into question. During this time, I was personally introduced to Harvey Cox at Harvard. Harvey Cox's book, The Secular City, was the rage at the time. And a lot of people read that. A lot of people were upset with the church and wanted to be more progressive. There were a lot of books about church change at that time. Somebody wrote a book called The Comfortable Pew. And then there was John A.D. Robinson's book, Honest to God. And then Cox wrote another book called The Secular City. And I read all these books, of course, and once preached a sermon, the title of which I gave, Going from the Comfortable Pew to the Secular City, Being Honest to God. So Cox took a liking to me and got me a scholarship to attend Harvard to do postdoctoral work in psychology and religion. And it was there that I sat in James Fowler's research group on faith development, stages of faith. And I think it was there in 1972 that I formulated for myself, and you'll have to formulate this for you, that the primary purpose of life after we have met the survival needs and the security needs is psychological and spiritual growth. That we are to be involved in the process of growing. And if you do that, how do you measure it? How do you know? This is our life work, I think. So during this time, I got to meet Robert Bellah, whose work on civil religion also called into question our understandings about God. I'm going to oversimplify the matter. What Bellah was talking about when he talked about civil religion is, what God is it that is referenced when at the end of the president's or a politician's speech they say, and God bless America? Which God is that? What God is that? Or what God is it that is prayed to before football games at Friday Night Lights? Another one of the major shifts in my own thinking occurred during this time and had to do with the works of Peter Berger. I was also reading Peter Berger while at Harvard and others on what we now know as the social construction of reality. Reality is what we agree to, what we agree to see and talk about something. Reality is a consensual agreement about what is real. Now, this is very important to acknowledge when we're seeking to experience and then express what I referred to last week as evidential evolutionary spirituality. And it was during this time that I got to meet and hear lecture and converse with John Cobb, who is one of the leading proponents of process philosophy, process theology, which holds, just like quantum physics does, that everything is in a process of changing and evolving, and everything is connected. And the very act of engaging a matter in observation changes both the observer and the observed. And he said this also applies to God. I thought about sticking a sentence in here, which I'm now doing, but it's not in the manuscript, that says there's nothing that upsets people anymore than to mess with their notion of what they think is real. And we want God to stay put, like our other things. But if God is that in which we live and move and have our being, and if we, like all of creation, are evolving, then so is God. Quantum physics would later confirm that the observer changes the observed. And we're going to get into talking about this next week when I talk about quantum theology. I remember long before I came to St. Paul's, the first time I referred to God as she in a sermon. You could hear the collective intake of breath. And yet, in 2008, not that long ago, when William Young, in his novel The Shack, gave God the appearance of an ample, matronly black woman, that also seemed to disturb some people. I thought it was great. Now, the church has, by and large, been either unaware of all this or resistant to it. There's a great deal of exciting change going on in the academic world under the umbrella of theology right to this moment. I mean, I think it's exciting, and I get excited about it and get excited about talking about it. It's like being in love. You want to talk about the person you're in love with, right? And that's this great person. I think most churches have been protected from this. And the Jesus Seminar attempted to make a big change by working outside of any church academic approved institution. They weren't sanctioned by any denomination, any university, anything. They were an independent organization. And maybe the church sees, because the church sees its main job is to conserve and transmit a 2,000-year-old tradition, it's been more invested in protecting the truth than in discovering it. And as a result, with few exceptions, the Christian church in America is dying. Both Richard Rohr and Jim Wallace, two quite committed Christians, are prophesying that the current wedding between evangelical Christianity and the political right will cost the church in general its credibility for years to come. Okay, long before I got involved with the Jesus Seminar, I had read, and by this time I'm teaching here, and I began to recommend to you two books that I had read. One by Karen Armstrong called The History of God, and the other also by her called The Battle for God. Now, I've had the opportunity to meet this woman, British former nun. She's a brilliant way of getting history in a teachable form. I want to be clear that the God that Karen Armstrong is talking about in these books is the God of Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. And that's the God that we started with today, who sits out there somewhere with a stick and stirs things from time to time. That's the God she is talking about. She's not talking about this God that I'm trying to get us into. But it's very helpful to know what she says. Just this last week, this was the cover of the belief section of the Houston Chronicle. It's about belief in God. Many people who don't believe in God still say they believe in a higher power. Now, this comes as a shock to many people, what I'm about to say. This understanding of God presented in Karen Armstrong, presented in mainline Christianity, Muslim, Jewish understanding of God, a male, always male, who lives high above the earth in a heavenly realm, did not exist in human consciousness until around 10,000 BC. We'll talk about prior to that next week. But God is a human construction, like all of religion. How did it get to be that humans, in understanding God, located God up, male and warlike? Well, it happened when the world community shifted from being hunter-gatherer community to being agricultural community. And we'll talk more about that. So I'm just sharing with you today pictures of my own God journey. I said it might remind you of some of your own journey, offer suggestions to places to visit. Why is it important? Of what relevance is it? Or should it be? And there are many answers to these questions, and they're going to make up the content of my talks for the coming weeks. I think we live in an exciting time. I mean, it's an exciting time out there, right? It's a combination of a Russian spy novel, a political 50 Shades of Grey, The Matrix, a television game show where you have to guess if doom and gloom or hope are behind door number 3, a combination to tell the truth, everything combined. And like in the Wizard of Oz movie, I keep thinking somebody will pull the curtain back and see what's really going on. I hope to live to see the end credits. And then maybe go out for a drink and talk about it afterwards. I do confess I am concerned for the future of my grandchildren if we as a culture keep doing what we're doing. Now, whether you're on the political right or a political left, we're in a new ball game. And most of us are not quite sure what the rules of this game are. I think as people who seek to experience peace, love, and joy, and patience, it's our job to gain clarity on what we mean by what it means to be a person of faith in this time, so that we can make a difference. Now, that's one of the things that quantum physics teaches us, is that you make a difference. By what you think and how you behave, we make a difference. Last week, I shared with you that my current understanding of what it means to be a Christian is that a Christian is a person who enthusiastically embraces the goal of living a life that reflects the values that grow out of a knowledge of and trust in the God of Jesus. That's what God is important. And Jesus leads us to a life that crosses all kinds of boundaries. There are no boundaries. And we live in a culture that is concerned about drawing lines and creating barriers. The life of Jesus, following Jesus, is a life that faces forward, not back. We're not going back. That's imperfect. There may be a desire to go back to what we imagine to be a grander time ecclesiastically or politically, but it won't happen. Evolution is pulling us forward. And we must have faith in the God of evolution, who's pulling us forward. And you can see that kind of life lived out in the call of Jesus to follow me. Where to? I don't know, but come on. That's why it takes faith. So what is faith? Faith for me is the radical openness to the truth, wherever it may come from, whatever it might be. A friend of mine who was Jewish and who just died this past year, a couple of years we talked on a really regular basis, and he was both ethnically and in practice a very devout Reformed Jew. And he gave me a book a few years ago that is still at my bedside. I read a little bit in it every day. It's a book by the great Jewish rabbi, thinker, philosopher Abraham Heschel. And the book has a great title, even though it's sexist. It's the title is God's Search for Man. You know, we might call this talk Man's Search for God, but it's really the other way around. Allowing ourselves to be found. This is what Heschel writes in this book. Religion declined not because it was refuted, but because it became irrelevant, dull, oppressive, insipid. When faith is completely replaced by creed, worship by discipline, love by habit, when the crisis of today is ignored because of the splendor of the past, when faith becomes an heirloom rather than a living fountain, when religion speaks only in the name of authority rather than with the voice of compassion, its message has become meaningless. Faith is a radical openness to the truth, wherever it may come from, whatever it may turn out to be. There is a word that has started popping up in the newspapers and in various other media today. The word is the one used to tell us that we can't always believe what we see or thought was true because we live in what is called a post-truth era. So we're greeted with things like alternative facts, fake news. Post-truth is the truth that is based on emotion, preference, allegiance, tribe, and grievance. It is not based on facts and evidence. What we're moving into is not just a new set of facts, but a new way of thinking. we live in a time when we do not simply have more tools in our toolbox, we have a chance to see reality differently. Much of what is destroying this planet and those of us who live upon it is the result of a lack of education. This leads to something people think is true because of those post-truth things, but it's not based on evidence. The massive ignorance that leads people and nations to think that the best solutions to the problems we have is killing each other, having a bigger military, is the result of incorrect knowledge. If we could teach that each and every person is of the same stardust essence, perhaps we would stop the killing and the hatred. Now, having said all of this, as much as we need rational thinking to dominate the conversations that would benefit us all, rational thinking is not the only or even best way of knowing. While it's certainly helpful, even essentially, the critical mind can't fully comprehend the most meaningful issues in life. I'm talking about God, love, sexuality, grace, suffering, death. For that, we need contemplative, non-dual consciousness, which is much more like intuitive knowledge. So we're going to continue to talk about rational matters, how we understand the sea of energy in which we live, because that determines everything about us. Whether we're aware of it or not, it's important. Our understanding of God shapes our spiritual life. Understand? Even though we may be driven to speak, what we say, at least what I'm attempting to share, is really about the unspeakable. Is that clear? It's about something that we cannot understand in any rational way. Understand? But if we don't make an effort to understand, we will likely never end up in a stance that transforms us. Is that clear? I hope not. Niels Bohr, the physicist whose work is changing how we think about so much, the cosmos and everything, he told a story about a young rabbinical student who went to hear 3 lectures by this very famous, learned rabbi. And later when he went back to his friends, and his friends asked him what he heard, he said, oh, it was a magnificent experience. His first lecture was so brilliant, so clear, so simple. I understood every word of what he said. The second lecture was even better. It was so deep, it was so subtle. I didn't understand very much, but it was clear that the rabbi did. But the third lecture, it was by far the best. It was a great, unforgettable experience. I understood nothing, and neither did the rabbi. No matter where you go this week, no matter what happens, remember this, you carry precious cargo to life and stuff. Oh, and stay for lunch. Give us 10 minutes, we'll get set up.